didn't do this. Please, someone believe me. Get her off my property now. She's a thief and a liar.
Should have seen this coming. What in God's name is happening to my daughter?
The handcuffs were cold against Evelyn Marsh's wrists, colder than anything she had felt in the 11 months she had scrubbed floors and pressed linens inside the Kingsley estate. She stood in the marble foyer she had polished 1,000 times, and she watched her own reflection twist in the mirror Diane Kingsley had imported from Milan, and she understood, in that single frozen second, that her life had just been taken from her by people who had never once bothered to learn how she took her coffee. "You will not touch my daughter," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. 6-year-old Daisy stood behind her, gripping the hem of her mother's uniform with both fists, her small face white with a fear no child should carry. A police officer knelt down to speak gently to her, but Daisy only stared past him at her mother, at the metal circling her wrists, and began to cry the way children cry when the world stops making sense. "She stole from this family," Diane Kingsley announced to the room, to the other staff gathered in the hallway, to anyone who would listen. Her voice had the practiced clarity of a woman accustomed to being believed. "The Kingsley diamond, gone from my vanity, and this woman was the only one with a key to that room." She said it the way she might announce the weather, flat and certain, as though Evelyn's guilt were simply a fact of the day, rather than an accusation she had invented an hour earlier over brunch. Evelyn had cleaned that vanity every single morning for 11 months. She had never once opened the drawer where the necklace was kept. She had a daughter to feed and a mother's memory to honor, and she had built her entire fragile life around the idea that hard work protected you from exactly this kind of moment. She was wrong. Hard work protected nothing when the people above you decided the truth was inconvenient. Bradley Kingsley leaned against the staircase railing with his arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression close to boredom, the same expression he wore when a delivery arrived late or a waiter forgot his order. He did not look at Evelyn. He looked at his phone. Somewhere in that indifference was the truest measure of what she had been to this family the entire time she worked there, a piece of furniture that occasionally needed correcting. The officer read Evelyn her rights while Daisy screamed for her mother, and a member of the household staff, a young woman named Priya who had shared lunch breaks with Evelyn for months, stood frozen in the hallway, too afraid of losing her own job to say a single word in Evelyn's defense. Silence, Evelyn would learn later, was the loudest sound in a house like this one. Everyone had seen something, no one would say it. They took her out through the same servant's entrance she had used every morning at 5:30, past the garden she had weeded on her hands and knees, past the kitchen window where she used to watch the sunrise while the coffee brewed for a family that never once asked how she slept. The neighbors watched from their windows. A photographer from a local society blog, tipped off by someone inside the house, captured the image that would follow Evelyn for the rest of the year, a woman in a gray uniform being placed into the back of a patrol car while her daughter screamed on the lawn. By evening, the story had a headline: Kingsley family housekeeper arrested in diamond theft. No one asked Evelyn her side. No one needed to. The Kingsley name did the talking, the way money always does the talking in rooms where poor people are simply expected to be guilty until an inconvenient truth proves otherwise. And even then, sometimes not even that is enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The holding cell smelled of bleach and old fear, and Evelyn sat on the metal bench with her knees pulled to her chest, replaying the last 11 months in fragments that refused to make sense. She thought of the day she was hired, how grateful she had been, how she had cried in her car afterward because the salary meant Daisy could finally see a real dentist. She thought of Walter Kingsley, the only member of that family who had ever looked her in the eye and said good morning like he meant it. Walter was dying. Everyone on staff knew it, though no one spoke of it directly. He had grown thin over the months, his study visits shorter, his voice quieter, And yet every single time Evelyn passed his door, he would call her name and ask about Daisy, ask about her mother's garden, ask questions that had nothing to do with dusting or laundry, and everything to do with treating another human being like she mattered. She wondered now if he even knew what had happened to her. She wondered if it would matter to him if he did. A public defender arrived 2 hours later, a tired man with a stack of folders under his arm, and no time to spare. He explained, without much warmth, that bail had been set at a number that might as well have been the moon. Evelyn had $400 in her checking account and a car that needed new brakes. There would be no bail. There would be a cell and a phone call, and a daughter somewhere in the system now, placed with a neighbor because there was no father listed and no family close enough to take her. That single fact broke something in Evelyn that the handcuffs had not managed to break. Daisy, alone, confused, asking a stranger where her mother had gone. Evelyn pressed her forehead against her knees and did not cry, because crying required a kind of hope that something might change, and in that moment, she could not locate any hope left inside her at all. She thought about her mother, Rosalind, who had raised her alone in a small apartment 2 towns over, who had worked 3 jobs and still found time to braid Evelyn's hair every morning before school. Rosalind used to say that the world would try to convince her she was small, and that the only defense against a world like that was refusing to believe it. Evelyn had believed her mother her entire life. Sitting in that cell, she was no longer sure the advice had ever been true. Near midnight, a guard came to tell her she had a visitor, which made no sense, because Evelyn knew no lawyers, no bondsmen, no one with the money or the will to show up for a housekeeper accused of theft. She walked to the visitation room expecting a mistake. Instead, she found a man she had never seen before in her life, sitting on the other side of the glass, wearing a plain gray coat and an expression that held none of the pity she had braced herself for. "My name is Nathaniel Hale," he said through the small speaker in the partition. "I don't work for the Kingsleys anymore, and I don't believe you stole anything." Evelyn stared at him, too exhausted to trust the small flicker of relief his words produced in her chest. "Why would you believe me over them?" she asked, and Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes steady in a way that made the fluorescent lighting feel almost bearable. "Because I've been watching that family for 8 months," he said quietly, "and the diamond disappeared 3 days before anyone reported it missing. I have the security logs to prove it." Evelyn's hands, still trembling from the hours in the cell, went still against the glass. For the first time since the handcuffs closed around her wrists, someone in the world seemed to be telling the truth, and she had no idea yet how dangerous that truth would turn out to be for everyone involved. Bail was posted the next morning by a name Evelyn did not recognize, a bonding company she had never heard of, funded by a wire transfer that led back to nothing traceable. She walked out of the county building into gray daylight, blinking against the brightness, and found Nathaniel Hale waiting by a black sedan parked at the curb, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Your daughter is with Detective Ellison right now," he said, before Evelyn could ask. "Family Services wanted to place her in emergency care, but Mara pulled some strings to keep her local until we sort this out." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled with relief. She had spent the night imagining Daisy in a stranger's house, frightened and alone, and the idea that someone, anyone, had thought to protect her daughter without being asked, felt almost too generous to accept without suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn asked, the same question she had asked through the glass the night before, and this time, Nathaniel did not answer right away. He opened the car door for her instead, and once she was inside, once the heat had begun to thaw the cold from her fingers, he finally spoke. "I used to do investigative work for wealthy families. Backgrounds, verifications, sometimes surveillance when a spouse suspected something. I did that work for 8 years and I got very good at knowing when someone was lying." He paused at a red light, his jaw tight. "The night that necklace disappeared, I was still doing surveillance on the property for an unrelated matter. I have footage that proves you never entered that room after your morning cleaning shift ended." Evelyn turned to look at him fully for the first time, taking in the tired lines around his eyes, the careful way he chose his words, like a man used to being doubted and having learned to compensate for it with precision. "Then why hasn't anyone seen this footage?" she asked, and Nathaniel's expression darkened in a way that told her the answer before he said it aloud. "Because the moment I tried to bring it to the police, my access to the security system was cut off remotely. Someone inside that house is protecting the real thief, and they moved fast enough to erase every trace before anyone thought to ask questions." They picked up Daisy from Detective Ellison's modest house on the edge of town, and the moment the little girl saw her mother through the window, she ran across the yard so fast she nearly fell, colliding into Evelyn's legs with the kind of desperate grip that broke something loose in Evelyn's chest all over again. She held her daughter and breathed in the smell of her hair and allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe that the worst part might be over. It was not close to over. Detective Mara Ellison stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, her badge catching the weak morning light. She was younger than Evelyn expected, sharp-eyed, clearly unimpressed by the Kingsley family's version of events. "I pulled the initial report myself," she said without preamble. "Diane Kingsley claims the necklace went missing sometime Tuesday night, but her own housekeeping log, the one she keeps for insurance purposes, shows the vanity room was locked and alarmed from Monday afternoon onward. Nobody entered that room except 2 people who had the override code." "Who?" Evelyn asked, though some cold, quiet part of her had already begun to suspect the answer. "Diane Kingsley," Mara said, "and Vanessa Cole, Bradley's fiancée." She let that settle in the air between them. "And Vanessa Cole has $40,000 in gambling debts that nobody in that family knows about yet, except possibly Bradley, who's been quietly covering some of her losses for the better part of a year." Evelyn spent that first free night in a motel room, paid for with the last of her savings, Daisy curled against her side, finally asleep after hours of quiet reassurance that the bad men were gone and nobody was going to take her mother away again. Evelyn did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and turned the pieces of Nathaniel's story over in her mind, trying to understand why a man who had once been paid handsomely to protect the Kingsley family's secrets would risk everything to protect her instead. She got her answer 3 days later when Nathaniel arrived at the motel with a folder thick enough to require both hands to carry, and a look on his face that told her whatever was inside had cost him something to gather. He sat across the small table from her, careful not to wake Daisy in the other bed, and slid the folder toward her. "Before you look at this," he said, "I need to tell you something about myself, because you deserve honesty, and I have not given you enough of it." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She had learned, over the last 11 months, exactly how much damage could hide behind a kind face. "Walter Kingsley hired me 8 months ago," Nathaniel continued, "not to investigate his family, to find you." Evelyn stared at him, uncomprehending. "Me? Why would Walter Kingsley need to find me? I worked in his house every day." "Not to find your address," Nathaniel said quietly. "To confirm who you were, your mother's name, where you were born, whether Rosalind Marsh had ever mentioned him." He watched her face carefully as he spoke, the way a man watches for a reaction he is afraid of causing. "Evelyn, Walter Kingsley knew your mother, decades ago, before Diane, before the company, before any of it. And I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that he has spent months trying to work up the courage to tell you why." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Evelyn thought of the countless mornings Walter had asked about her mother's garden, about Rosalind's health years before she passed. Questions that had felt kind, but oddly specific at the time. She had assumed he was simply a generous old man making conversation with the staff. She had never imagined he was asking because he already knew the answers to half his own questions. "He hired you to investigate me," she said slowly, "and instead, you're sitting in a motel room telling me my boss might have known my mother." Nathaniel nodded once. "I stopped reporting to him 2 months ago. I told him I couldn't finish the assignment. I did not tell him why. The truth is, I'd started watching how his family treated you, and I couldn't stomach handing over information that might make things worse for you if his intentions turned out to be anything less than good. Evelyn opened the folder. Inside were photographs, timestamps, printed transcripts of financial transfers, records of a woman named Vanessa Cole visiting 3 different pawn shops in the 2 weeks before the diamond's disappearance was even reported. There was also, tucked beneath the surveillance material, a yellowed photograph of a much younger Walter Kingsley standing beside a woman who looked so much like Evelyn that her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photograph was smiling the exact smile Evelyn saw in her own mirror every morning. "That's my mother," she whispered. "Yes," Nathaniel said gently. "Taken 36 years ago, according to the note on the back. Before Walter married Diane. Before any of this." He hesitated, choosing his next words with visible care. "Evelyn, I think Walter Kingsley is your father." Evelyn did not sleep that night either, but for an entirely different reason than the one before. She sat with the photograph until the edges of it softened under her thumb, studying her mother's face for some clue Rosalind had never given her, some hint buried in 36 years of silence. Her mother had never once mentioned a Walter, never once hinted that the man Evelyn had spent the last 11 months serving coffee to might share her blood. She thought about every conversation, every small kindness, every time Walter had lingered a beat too long in the hallway to ask how Daisy was doing in school. She had mistaken it for the ordinary warmth of a decent employer. Now she wondered if it had been something closer to grief, an old man watching his daughter clean his floors and being too afraid, or too ashamed, to say the words that might explain why he could never stop watching her. Nathaniel arranged the meeting 2 days later at a small diner far from the Kingsley estate, chosen deliberately because Walter insisted on discretion. He arrived in a wheelchair pushed by a home health aide, thinner than Evelyn remembered from her cleaning rounds, an oxygen tube resting beneath his nose. He looked, in that fluorescent-lit booth, like a man who had spent his final months carrying a weight he could no longer set down alone. "I should have told you the day you were hired," he said, before Evelyn had even settled into her seat. "I recognized your name on the application. I told myself I was imagining things, that Marsh was a common enough surname, but then I saw your face, and I knew." His hands trembled slightly around his water glass. "Your mother and I were together for 2 years, before my own father arranged my marriage to Diane's family, for reasons that had everything to do with money and nothing to do with love. I was young and weak, and I let him end it. I never knew Rosalind was pregnant. She never told me, and I never thought to ask, because I convinced myself walking away clean was kinder than staying and complicating both our lives." Evelyn's hands were flat on the table, steadying herself against a version of her own history she had never been given the chance to know. "She raised me alone," she said, her voice tight. 3 jobs, no help from anyone. She died exhausted at 52 because she could never afford to slow down. The accusation in her voice was unmistakable, and Walter did not flinch from it. "I know," he said quietly. "I have spent 8 months trying to find a way to make that right. And I understand now there is no version of restitution that gives you back the childhood you should have had. I am not asking for forgiveness, Evelyn. I am asking for the chance to make sure my grandchildren, your grandchildren, are never treated the way my family has treated you this past year." He reached into his coat with visibly weakened hands and produced a folded document. "I have already amended my will. Half of my estate goes to you upon my death, not as charity. As restitution for 26 years my daughter should have had a father capable of providing for her." "I don't want your money," Evelyn said, and meant it more fiercely than she had meant anything in months. "I want to know why your wife had me arrested for a crime I didn't commit, while the real thief sits at your family's dinner table every night." Walter's face went gray in a way that had nothing to do with his illness. "Diane doesn't know I've changed the will yet," he said slowly. "But if she suspected, even for a moment, that I intended to bring you into this family publicly, she would do exactly what she's done. Remove the threat before it could take root. He looked at Evelyn with something close to horror dawning behind his eyes. I think I may have caused this. I think my inquiries into your background may have reached her sooner than I realized, and I think she moved to destroy you before I ever had the chance to explain myself. Detective Mara Ellison called 2 days later with news that changed the shape of everything. She met Evelyn and Nathaniel in the parking lot of a coffee shop, a manila folder tucked under her arm, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who had just proven something she'd suspected from the start. I found the necklace, she said without ceremony. Or what's left of the transaction trail, anyway. Vanessa Cole pawned a diamond matching the Kingsley piece's description at a shop 2 counties over, 9 days before Diane Kingsley ever reported it missing. She spread photographs across the hood of her car. Grainy security footage showed a woman in a dark coat and sunglasses, her face angled away from the camera but her build, her walk, unmistakably Vanessa's. The pawnshop's paperwork listed a fake name, but the fingerprints lifted from the transaction slip, obtained through a warrant Mara had spent 3 sleepless nights securing, matched Vanessa Cole's prints on file from an unrelated speeding citation 2 years earlier. Why would she wait 9 days to report it stolen? Evelyn asked, and Mara's mouth tightened into something like a grim smile. Because Diane didn't know it was gone yet. She barely wears that piece. It sits in a vault most of the year. My guess is Vanessa needed cash fast for her gambling debts, took the necklace, had it appraised and pawned before anyone would notice, and only got nervous when Diane mentioned pulling it out for a charity gala. That's when the story about a missing necklace suddenly appeared, and that's when you became the most convenient person in the house to blame. Nathaniel leaned against the car, arms crossed, his jaw tight with the particular anger of a man who had spent months collecting proof that no one in power wanted to look at. Bradley knew, he said. He's been covering Vanessa's debts for a year. There's no way he didn't recognize what she'd done the moment Diane started asking questions. He let Evelyn take the fall rather than risk exposing his fiancé's gambling problem to his mother. Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest, not relief exactly, but the beginning of a colder, steadier kind of clarity. For 11 months she had cleaned this family's home, cooked for their guests, tended their garden, and not one of them, save Walter, had ever seen her as anything more than a convenience. Now she understood the full shape of what she was up against. It was not simply an accusation. It was an entire family's willingness to sacrifice her and her daughter to protect one woman's secret and one son's comfort. I want this in front of a judge, Evelyn said. Not a quiet settlement. Not a payoff to make me disappear. I want Diane Kingsley to stand in a courtroom and explain why she had a mother arrested in front of her 6-year-old daughter for a crime her own future daughter-in-law committed. Mara nodded slowly, already reaching for her phone. Then let's build a case strong enough that no lawyer in the state can talk their way around it. The warning came the way threats from powerful families always come, wrapped in the language of concern. Thaddeus Wren, the Kingsley family's longtime attorney, appeared at Evelyn's motel door 2 days later, dressed in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, his smile the practiced kind that never once reached his eyes. Mrs. Kingsley wanted me to extend an offer, he said, stepping just inside the doorway without being invited. A generous settlement. $100,000 in exchange for your silence and a written statement that the charges were the result of a misunderstanding you no longer wish to pursue. A misunderstanding, Evelyn repeated, standing between the lawyer and the bed where Daisy sat coloring, oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. I was arrested in front of my daughter for something Vanessa Cole did. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a lie your client told to protect her son's engagement. Thaddeus's smile did not waver, though something colder settled behind his eyes. I would think carefully before rejecting this offer, Mrs. Marsh. The Kingsley family has resources most people can only imagine. Legal resources. Financial resources. The kind of resources that can make a woman's life extraordinarily difficult if she insists on pursuing a fight she cannot win. He glanced toward Daisy, and something in that glance made Evelyn's blood run cold in a way no threat aimed directly at her ever could have. Custody situations can become complicated, for instance, when a mother has no stable housing and an active criminal case attached to her name, regardless of how that case eventually resolves. Evelyn's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Get out of this room," she said, her voice low and shaking with a fury she had been suppressing for days. "Tell Diane Kingsley I'll see her in court, and tell her that if she ever mentions my daughter again, I will make sure every reporter in this city knows exactly how her family operates." Thaddeus left without another word, but the threat hung in the room long after the door closed behind him, a reminder that the Kingsleys had no intention of losing quietly. That night, Nathaniel sat across from Evelyn at the small motel table, watching her hands shake as she recounted the visit. "They're scared," he said finally. "People like Diane Kingsley don't send lawyers to make settlement offers unless they're genuinely afraid of what a trial might expose. The threat about Daisy was meant to make you fold. It means the evidence we have is stronger than they're willing to admit out loud." Evelyn looked up at him, exhausted in a way that went past sleep and into something more permanent. "I can't lose my daughter fighting for the truth," she said. "But I also can't teach her that the truth doesn't matter when the people lying about you have more money than you do." 3 nights after Thaddeus Wren's visit, Evelyn discovered something that nearly unraveled every fragile piece of trust she had built with Nathaniel over the previous weeks. Sorting through the folder he had first shown her at the motel table, she found a second document tucked behind the surveillance photographs, an invoice, dated 8 months earlier, listing a $50,000 payment from Walter Kingsley to a private investigations firm registered under Nathaniel's name. She sat with the invoice for a long time before confronting him, turning it over in her hands as though staring at it long enough might change the numbers printed across the page. When he arrived that evening to check on Daisy, as he had taken to doing most nights, Evelyn set the invoice on the table between them without a word and watched something close to resignation settle across his face, as though he had known this moment was always coming and had simply been hoping to delay it a little longer. "You told me you stopped working for Walter because it didn't feel right," she said, her voice quiet, but edged with the particular hurt of someone who had allowed themselves to trust too quickly after a lifetime of learning not to. "You didn't tell me you were paid $50,000 to investigate me in the first place. That's not a small detail to leave out, Nathaniel." He did not reach for excuses, did not try to soften what the invoice plainly showed. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you everything the night I visited you in that cell. I was afraid that if I led with the money, you'd never trust anything else I said afterward, and I needed you to hear the truth about the necklace before you had a reason to dismiss me entirely." "So you decided which truths I deserved to hear first," Evelyn said, standing now, putting distance between them that felt necessary, even as some part of her recognized how much she had come to rely on his steadiness over the past weeks. "I have spent my entire life with people deciding what version of the truth I'm allowed to have, Nathaniel. Diane decided I was guilty. George decided our marriage meant nothing the moment it became inconvenient. And now you decided I could handle some of the truth, but not all of it, at the exact moment I needed to know who I could actually trust." Nathaniel stood as well, but he did not move closer, giving her the space she clearly needed. "You're allowed to be angry," he said. "You're allowed to tell me to leave and never come back, and I'll go, because you deserve someone who never once makes you question what they're not telling you. But before you decide that, I need you to know the rest of it. I took Walter's money because I needed the work, and because at first, finding you was just another job like any other. It stopped being a job the moment I watched Diane's family treat you the way they did. I kept working the case without telling Walter, using my own money, because by then I wasn't doing it for him anymore. I was doing it because walking away felt like becoming exactly the kind of man who looks away when someone is being destroyed and decides it isn't his problem." Evelyn did not respond immediately. She thought of her mother's voice, the old warning about the world convincing her she was small. and she thought about how many times over the past year she had allowed fear to make her decisions instead of clarity. "I need time," she finally said, and Nathaniel nodded, accepting the boundary without argument, gathering his coat and stepping toward the door. "Take whatever time you need," he said quietly, pausing with his hand on the doorframe. "But I want you to know something before I go. Everything in that folder, every photograph, every log, every hour I spent building the case that's going to clear your name, none of it was about the $50,000 anymore. It hasn't been about that money in months. I just didn't know how to tell you that without it sounding like exactly the kind of excuse a guilty man makes." He left, and Evelyn sat alone in the quiet apartment for a long time afterward, turning the invoice over in her hands, trying to decide whether trust, once broken, could ever be rebuilt into something sturdy enough to survive what still lay ahead of her. It took 4 days for Evelyn to call him again, 4 days of watching Daisy ask when Nathaniel was coming back, 4 days of realizing that her daughter had already decided, in the uncomplicated way children decide these things, that he belonged in their lives regardless of what an old invoice suggested about how he had arrived there. When Evelyn finally called, she did not apologize, and she did not pretend the hurt had fully disappeared. "I still need honesty," she told him. "All of it, even when it's inconvenient. Even when you're afraid of how I'll react. That's the only way this works, Nathaniel. Whatever this is." He agreed without hesitation, and something in his voice told her he understood exactly how close he had come to losing something he had not fully realized he wanted to keep. The lawyer Nathaniel called was a woman named Priscilla Odom, who had spent 15 years representing domestic workers against employers who assumed their money made them untouchable. She met Evelyn in a small office above a laundromat, stacks of case files lining every wall, and listened to the entire story without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad while Evelyn spoke. "Here's what we have working in our favor," Priscilla said when Evelyn finished. "Detective Ellison's investigation is clean. The pawnshop fingerprints are irrefutable. The security logs showing the vanity room's access history contradict Diane Kingsley's own statement to police. And Walter Kingsley, the head of the household, is prepared to testify that he believes his wife orchestrated a false accusation to protect his son's engagement." She set down her pen. "What we don't have yet is Vanessa Cole's own words. If she panics and tries to run, or worse, if she destroys evidence before we can subpoena her financial records properly, this becomes a much harder case to win in front of a jury." Nathaniel spoke up from the corner of the office where he'd been standing quietly. "I can get to her," he said. "Not through intimidation, through the truth. If Vanessa understands that the evidence already exists independent of anything she says, she may realize her only path forward is cooperation, rather than continued denial." Priscilla considered this, then nodded slowly. "Approach her alone, away from Bradley and Diane. Desperate people sometimes tell the truth when they finally understand lying has stopped protecting them." It took 3 days to find a moment when Vanessa Cole was alone, sitting in a downtown cafe 2 blocks from the boutique where she worked part-time, nursing a coffee with the hollow, exhausted look of a woman being slowly crushed by a secret too large to carry. Nathaniel sat down across from her without asking permission, and watched her face drain of color the moment she recognized him. "I know about the gambling debts," he said quietly, before she could get up and leave. "I know about the gambling debts, the fake name, the timeline that doesn't match Diane's story. I'm not here to threaten you, Vanessa. I'm here because an innocent woman is facing years in prison for something you did, and her 6-year-old daughter has already spent one night believing her mother might never come home." Vanessa's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "Bradley said it would all just disappear," she whispered. "He said his mother would handle it, that nobody would look too closely at a housekeeper's story once the family closed ranks." "They're not closing ranks to protect you," Nathaniel said gently. "They're closing ranks to protect the family name. The moment this trial starts, and it will start, Vanessa, Diane Kingsley will let you take the fall just as easily as she let Evelyn take it, if it means preserving her son's reputation. He slid a business card across the table, Priscilla's information printed in simple black letters. You have one chance to tell the truth before the evidence tells it for you. After that, cooperation stops mattering to a jury. Vanessa Cole walked into Priscilla Odom's office 4 days later, alone, without Bradley, without a lawyer of her own, carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had run out of places to hide. She sat across from Evelyn for the first time since the arrest, and for a long moment neither woman spoke, the silence heavy with everything that had happened in the weeks between them. "I'm sorry," Vanessa finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I panicked. I owed money to people who don't send polite reminders when payments are late, and the necklace was just sitting there, and I told myself I'd find a way to pay it back before anyone noticed. Then Diane wanted to wear it for the gala, and I knew I had maybe a day before everything fell apart, and Bradley told me his mother already had suspicions about the housekeeper. He said it would be easier that way. He said you'd probably just get a warning. I got arrested in front of my daughter," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering underneath. "I spent a night in a cell, wondering if I'd ever see her again. Do you understand what that cost me? What it's still costing me?" Vanessa flinched, tears finally spilling over. "I know. I've known since the moment I heard you'd been arrested, and I told myself I'd fix it, and every day that passed made it harder to imagine how. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I came here because Nathaniel was right. I can't carry this anymore." Priscilla slid a formal statement across the table, prepared in advance for exactly this possibility. This document lays out everything. The debts, the necklace, the pawn shop, Bradley's knowledge and involvement in covering it up. If you sign this and testify to its contents in court, it becomes evidence strong enough to clear Evelyn's name completely and expose the Kingsley family's role in what happened to her. Vanessa's hand shook as she picked up the pen, and for a long moment she simply stared at the page, weighing whatever remained of her relationship with Bradley against the weight of what she had allowed to happen to an innocent woman. She signed. Word reached Diane Kingsley within hours, through channels Priscilla had anticipated and quietly monitored. By that evening, Thaddeus Wren called Priscilla's office directly, his composure noticeably thinner than it had been at the motel door weeks earlier. "My client would like to discuss a resolution before this reaches a courtroom," he said, and Priscilla, sitting across from Evelyn with the signed confession secured in a locked file, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Tell your client," she said, "that the time for quiet resolutions ended the moment she had an innocent woman arrested in front of her child. We'll see her in court." The knock came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, and Evelyn nearly dropped the dish towel in her hands when she opened the door to find George Marsh standing on her porch, dressed in a suit that looked borrowed rather than owned, his expression arranged into the particular sincerity of a man who had learned exactly which face worked best when he needed something. He had left when Daisy was 2, unable or unwilling to handle the weight of fatherhood, and Evelyn had not heard from him in nearly 4 years. Not a phone call, not a birthday card, nothing but silence that she had eventually stopped waiting to be broken. "I saw the news," George said, before Evelyn could ask why he had come. "About the arrest, about the lawsuit. I wanted to make sure Daisy was okay." Evelyn stood in the doorway, blocking his view into the house, where her daughter sat coloring at the kitchen table, and felt the old, familiar exhaustion of dealing with a man who had never once shown up when it mattered, and always managed to appear the moment something might benefit him. "She's fine," Evelyn said flatly. "No thanks to you. What do you actually want, George?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Evelyn saw the truth arrive a full 10 seconds before he spoke it aloud. "I've been talking to a lawyer," he said, "about custody. With everything going on, the arrest, the trial, all this attention, a judge might look favorably on Daisy having a stable 2-parent household, instead of whatever situation you've got going on with this Nathaniel guy. The papers keep mentioning. The words landed like a physical blow, and Evelyn felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. The same fury she had felt facing down Thaddeus Wren rising in her chest all over again. "You haven't seen your daughter in 4 years," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You didn't call when she started kindergarten. You didn't call when she had her tonsils removed. You didn't call the night I was arrested and she watched police put her mother in handcuffs, and now, 3 days before I finally get the chance to clear my name in court, you show up talking about custody because you think my legal troubles make me look weak enough to challenge." George's practiced sincerity faltered slightly under the weight of her words, but he did not leave. "I'm still her father, Evelyn. I have rights." "You have nothing," Evelyn said, "except whatever a judge decides you've earned. And I promise you, George, no court in this state is going to hand a child to a man who abandoned her at 2 years old the moment his current situation happens to look convenient." She stepped back and closed the door, her hands still shaking, and stood in her small kitchen trying to steady her breathing before Daisy could notice anything was wrong. She called Priscilla that evening, and the lawyer's response was immediate and reassuring in the way only genuine expertise can be. "He has no case," Priscilla said. 4 years of documented absence, no child support paid, no established relationship. Courts don't reward opportunism, Evelyn. If anything, this makes our position stronger, because it shows a pattern of people trying to exploit your situation the moment you're vulnerable. And that pattern matters when a judge is weighing your character against the accusations Diane Kingsley made. Still, the visit left a mark, another reminder of how many people seemed willing to circle the moment they smelled weakness, and how few had ever shown up simply because it was the right thing to do. Nathaniel arrived later that night, having heard about George's visit from Detective Ellison, who kept a watchful eye on Evelyn's address, more out of personal investment than professional obligation at this point. He did not say much, simply sat beside her on the small porch steps and let the silence stretch between them, comfortable in a way it had not been comfortable during the days after the invoice, back when trust between them still felt fragile enough to shatter. "He's not getting her," Nathaniel finally said, and Evelyn appreciated that he did not frame it as a promise he couldn't keep, but as a simple statement of fact, born from confidence in the legal case Priscilla had already built. Whatever else happens in that courtroom, Daisy stays with the person who has spent every single day of her life actually showing up. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe that the people who mattered were finally the ones standing beside her. The courtroom was smaller than Evelyn had imagined, wood-paneled and quiet, filled with a strange collection of people whose lives had collided over the course of one stolen necklace. Diane Kingsley sat rigid in the front row beside Thaddeus Wren, her expensive suit doing little to soften the cold fury etched into her face. Bradley sat 2 seats away from Vanessa, the distance between them a silent testament to a relationship that had not survived the truth. Walter Kingsley sat in a wheelchair near the aisle, an oxygen tank beside him, his eyes fixed on Evelyn, with an expression that held equal parts pride and grief. Priscilla Odom stood before Judge Corrine Abbott and laid out the case with the precision of a woman who had spent 15 years watching wealthy families underestimate the people they exploited. She presented the security logs showing the vanity room's access history, the pawn shop surveillance footage, the fingerprint match, and finally, Vanessa Cole's signed confession, read aloud in full for the record, while Diane Kingsley's face grew paler with every sentence. When it came time for Evelyn to testify, she stood at the witness stand and looked directly at Diane Kingsley, refusing to let her voice shake. "I cleaned that woman's house for 11 months, she said. "I raised my daughter alone, worked every holiday she asked me to work, and never once complained, because I needed that job to survive. And the moment it became convenient to blame someone, she chose me, not because there was any evidence against me, but because she knew people like me are expected to disappear quietly when powerful families decide we're inconvenient." She paused, steadying herself. "I am done disappearing quietly." Walter Kingsley testified next, his voice weakened by illness but clear enough to carry through the courtroom. He spoke of his relationship with Rosalind Marsh decades earlier, of the daughter he never knew existed until months before his own death, of watching Evelyn work in his home for nearly a year without finding the courage to tell her the truth. "My wife did not simply make an accusation," he said, looking directly at Diane for the first time since the trial began. "She destroyed an innocent woman's reputation and endangered her custody of her own daughter, to protect a secret that was never hers to protect in the first place. I have spent my entire adult life being too weak to do the right thing when it mattered. I will not be weak about this." The verdict, when it finally came, cleared Evelyn of every charge. Vanessa Cole accepted a plea agreement that included restitution and a suspended sentence in exchange for her full cooperation. Diane Kingsley, facing a separate civil suit for malicious prosecution and defamation, watched her husband's testimony dismantle the version of their marriage she had spent decades curating for public consumption. Bradley left the courtroom without looking at anyone. His engagement, his mother's approval, and his father's remaining respect all gone within the span of a single afternoon. Walter Kingsley died 6 weeks after the trial ended, quietly, in his sleep, with Evelyn and Daisy in the room beside him for the final hours, a request he had made through Nathaniel days before his body finally gave out. He held Daisy's small hand in his own frail one and told her stories about her grandmother Rosalind, about a garden she had once kept full of tomatoes and marigolds, about a laugh that Walter said he still heard sometimes in quiet rooms decades later. Daisy, too young to fully understand what was happening, simply held his hand and told him about her favorite dinosaur, and Walter laughed in a way Evelyn had never once heard him laugh in 11 months of cleaning his house. The will was read 3 weeks later in Thaddeus Wren's office, though Thaddeus himself had quietly resigned from representing Diane's interests once the civil suit made his continued involvement untenable. Half of Walter's estate went to Evelyn, exactly as he had promised in the diner months earlier. A trust was established for Daisy's education, fully funded and untouchable by anyone outside her own adult decisions. Diane Kingsley received the house and a modest allowance, a deliberate choice Walter had explained in a letter attached to the will, stating plainly that he no longer trusted his wife with the kind of unrestricted wealth she had spent their marriage using as a weapon against people with less power than herself. Evelyn did not celebrate the inheritance. She sat in her small apartment that evening with Daisy asleep in the next room, and she thought about the 11 months she had scrubbed floors in a house that belonged, in some strange cosmic sense, half to her the entire time. She thought about her mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion 2 towns over, never once suspecting that the man who fathered her only child had spent his life building an empire that could have changed everything, had he simply found the courage to knock on the right door decades sooner. "He should have told her," Evelyn said quietly to Nathaniel, who had become a steady presence in her life in the months since the trial ended, though neither of them had yet named what that presence had become. "My mother worked herself to death because Walter Kingsley was too afraid to admit what he'd done." Nathaniel did not offer easy comfort or excuses on Walter's behalf. "You're right," he said simply, "and nothing about this money changes what your mother went through, but it can change what happens to Daisy. That's not nothing, Evelyn. That's everything, actually, if you let it be." Evelyn used a portion of the inheritance to establish a legal defense fund for domestic workers facing false accusations from wealthy employers, naming it after her mother, the Rosalind Marsh Foundation, staffed by attorneys willing to take cases most firms considered too small or too politically risky to pursue. Within its first year, the foundation successfully defended 11 housekeepers, nannies, and caregivers against wrongful termination and false criminal accusations, funding legal representation that would have otherwise been financially impossible for women in positions identical to the one Evelyn had once occupied. She thought often of Priya, the young housekeeper who had stood frozen in the Kingsley hallway the day of her arrest, too afraid to speak up in her defense. Priya reached out months later, tearful and apologetic, explaining that she had been supporting her own mother's medical bills and could not risk losing her job by contradicting Diane Kingsley in the moment. Evelyn, who understood exactly what desperation could silence in a person, forgave her without hesitation and offered her a position with the foundation instead, work that did not require silence in the face of injustice. Detective Mara Ellison remained a friend long after the case closed, occasionally stopping by the small foundation office with case referrals from other precincts, domestic workers whose stories mirrored Evelyn's own with painful familiarity. "You'd be surprised how common this is," Mara told her one afternoon, dropping a new folder on Evelyn's desk. "Rich families protecting their own at the expense of the people who keep their houses running. Most of these women never had anyone willing to fight for them the way Nathaniel fought for you." Evelyn looked at the folder, at another name, another story that could have so easily been her own, and felt the particular determination that had carried her through the worst months of her life settle once more into her chest. Vanessa Cole completed her restitution and community service quietly, eventually reaching out to Evelyn through the foundation to volunteer, an offer Evelyn considered for a long time before finally accepting under strict boundaries. "I'm not doing this because we're friends," Evelyn told her plainly during their first meeting back. "I'm doing this because you understand exactly how fast desperation can convince a person to make a choice that destroys someone else's life. And that kind of understanding is useful to women who walk through our doors in crisis." Vanessa nodded, grateful for a chance at redemption she knew she had not fully earned, and worked harder in the months that followed than she had worked at anything in her privileged life before that courtroom. Nathaniel proposed on an ordinary Tuesday evening in the small backyard of the house Evelyn had finally purchased with a portion of her inheritance, while Daisy chased fireflies across the grass in the fading summer light. He did not plan an elaborate speech or an audience of family and friends. He simply knelt beside the garden Evelyn had started planting that spring, the same tomatoes and marigolds her mother had once grown 2 towns over, and told her that he had spent his entire career learning to uncover other people's secrets, and the only truth he had ever wanted to build a life around was the one sitting across from him. "I don't need you to save me," Evelyn told him, taking his hand and pulling him back to his feet before he could finish the question. "I already saved myself. I just want you standing beside me while I keep doing it." Nathaniel laughed, the sound warm and unguarded in a way she had rarely heard from him during the darkest months of the trial. "Then say yes anyway," he said, "because I'd like the honor of standing beside you for the rest of it." She said yes. They were married the following spring, a small ceremony in the same backyard, Daisy serving as flower girl, with an enthusiasm that scattered petals across half the guests instead of the aisle. Detective Ellison attended in her off-duty clothes, uncharacteristically emotional for a woman who spent her days investigating the worst of human behavior. Priscilla Odom gave a toast that referenced case law in a way that made half the guests laugh, despite not fully understanding the joke. Priya stood near the back, tearful and grateful for a second chance she had not expected to receive. Diane Kingsley was not invited, and did not ask to be. She lived out her remaining years in the house Walter left her, increasingly isolated as the story of the trial followed her socially long after the legal consequences had concluded. Bradley moved out of state, his engagement to Vanessa long since ended, his relationship with what remained of his family reduced to occasional, strained phone calls that grew less frequent with each passing year. George's custody claim collapsed within a week of the trial's conclusion, exactly as Priscilla had predicted. Faced with 4 years of documented absence and no history of child support, his attorney withdrew the filing before it ever reached a judge's desk, and George disappeared from Evelyn's life a second time, this time by her own choice rather than his abandonment, a distinction that mattered more to her than she expected it to. Daisy never knew how close the attempt had come to disrupting the fragile stability they were still rebuilding, and Evelyn intended to keep it that way for as long as she possibly could. Evelyn stood in her garden on the evening of her wedding, watching her daughter dance barefoot across the grass with the kind of unguarded joy that had once felt impossibly far away, and she thought about the woman she had been 11 months into a job that nearly destroyed her, and the woman she had become in the year since. She had not been rescued. She had been believed, finally, by people willing to fight alongside her rather than for her, and there was a difference between those two things that she intended to spend the rest of her life teaching her daughter to recognize. "I choose this," she said quietly to Nathaniel as the sun set behind them, echoing words she did not yet know belonged to 100 other women who had found themselves standing exactly where she once stood, disbelieved and alone, before someone finally chose to see them clearly. "Every single day, I choose this, and I choose to make sure no other mother has to fight this hard just to be believed." Nathaniel pulled her close, and somewhere behind them, Daisy laughed at nothing in particular, the sound of a childhood finally allowed to be simple again, and the two of them stood together in the fading light, having built, from the wreckage of an accusation that should have destroyed them both, a life neither one of them had ever expected to find.